Hi class, so welcome back. So now we are going to have another new lesson for today, and that is what we call political flows. So I'm not using any earphones right now, but I hope you can still hear me. I am now at the place that is a bit smaller than the usual, so I hope that you can still hear me. Anyway, again, my name is Miss Celine, and right now we are going to have another new topic, and the title is Political Flows, Its Structures and Process. And again, this is the contemporary world. Alright, so for the learning outcomes of this lesson, first we are going to explain the factors to global political flow. Second is discuss the threats to the nation states. Third, analyze the changes in global nation state relations. And lastly, examine the roles of INGOs and IGOs in promoting a civil society. Now let's start. So let's talk about how global politics flows. So I've already mentioned in our previous topic what is flow is all about. So I've also described it as like a water, but however, flow is actually different. It's actually more on how it's approached in global economy. I mean, yes, in global economy and how it actually uh, run through and affects our globalization. But right now, we are going to talk about more about how global politics flows. All right, so global politics flows, or it moves from the different areas of the world to the through the following. First is because of our refugees rather, and undocumented immigrants. Second is oil and water crisis. One of the things that actually we are currently dealing right now, the oil crisis. Third is the MNCs or the multinational companies. Next is the global climate change, borderless disease, like for example, the COVID-19 is an example, war and terrorism, and also global inequalities. Now let's go to it one by one. Now let's start and let's talk about refugees. So we all know that if there's a refugee, it means to say that they came from a country, a state, or even a place that is having a crisis right now, or they are having a difficulty um, uh, politically in their place. Like for example, there's a civil war, or there is I'm sorry to say, not per se civil war, but there is a riot, a revolution that's going on, and there are a lot of civilians rather, out there are now um, getting away from them, so or getting out of the place because it's dangerous, it's no longer healthy to live there. So we have refugees. Now these refugees possess a direct threat to the nation state and its ability to control its borders. So if a refugee actually transferred, that's why they are called refugees, so they transferred into another state or um, another country. Okay, so these refugees will actually give threat to that nation or to that state, because of that, other people from other countries can have an access to their protected property, and still a country still have this nationality, and because of that, refugees tend to migrate from their location, and then it might also, because of that, they are actually escaping that specific scenario, and then they actually go to this specific country, so it will actually pose a threat to the country where they transferred. Next is oil and water crisis. I've already mentioned this a while ago. Oil is something that we are actually experiencing right now. Our diesel is actually very high on top of the roof rather. It's already, I believe, 62 or 64 pesos already, and it's really expensive. So oil and water crisis actually exhibits political flow as well. So it can lead to riots and insurrections, to the downfall of existing governments because of the rising oil and water. Okay, actually people tend to go against the government because of not doing anything about it, or they can actually do something that is opposing to the government, and it will shaken that government. So unfortunately, our country right now, because of the war in Ukraine and also in Russia, there's a war. So unfortunately, we are actually having an oil crisis. All right, and because of that, so I don't know in other countries if they're already having riots or anything, but in our country so far, we don't have any riots yet. I don't know. I hope there will not be any riots, but that actually because of the oil and water crisis, any conflict and danger that is being posed because of this can actually trigger people to do something. All right, so that's one of the political flows. Next is the multinational companies. There are the MNCs. So, like for example, here I have the picture of Adidas. So, political flows actually happens because of the multinational companies as well. So, first is the inability of the nation state to control economic flows. Controlled by the multinational corporations is also a threat. So, if a country wasn't able to control their economic flows, so I've already mentioned this in our previous lesson, the economic flows that is going on, and because of that is also headed by the multinational corporations, that could also pose a threat to the country and also to the political aspect of the country. Next is the global climate change. So, climate change actually um, has an impact in our country, not only in our country, but also in the world. Okay, so that's why we have activists and also uh, advocates that encourage people to actually focus on climate change. Well, others are being skeptics about it, but global climate change do have an effect on the political flows. So let me just read that. So environmental problems like the climate change are very likely to be destabilizing politically because of the climate changes that we have, also because of the trees, the deforestation, and also the different, like for example, here in our country, because of the continuous thunderstorms, continuous rainfall in the different provinces, it actually can affect our rice crops, our different kinds of food productions. And because of that, our economy is being affected. And because the economy is being affected, our our political flows actually is affected as well. So that's why global climate change is affected as well. All right. So this is what I've mentioned a while ago because of global or borderless disease. So recently we just finished our government just lifted up the pandemic. So we just got out from the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully it will not be back again. But different kinds of pandemics, like for example, malaria, Zika, AIDS is actually a silent pandemic. Actually, it's still an epidemic, but it actually do affect the world. It do affect our global yes, the world itself. And of course, we have the COVID-19 virus pose a dangerous to political structures. Because of these pandemics, this global or borderless diseases, our economy is being affected, and because of that, the different political outcomes and ways in our country, not just our in a country but in the world, are affected as well. So that's why, if I might remember, President Trump, our former, I mean, their former President Trump, actually posed. He wanted to file a case against China for starting the pandemic, and so is the other countries. But in other countries, they say that pandemic is actually a natural thing. It's not. It's not. It is something that we should understand. It happens all the time. I mean, there are pandemics everywhere. It can happen years after now. It can happen. But for Trump, he believes that it's something that has to do with politics, because he believes that China tries to destabilize the first world country, which is of course the America. So that's one thing. And because of that, it's really obvious that because of that, we have this term political flows. And because of the pandemic, because of COVID-19, political flows or politics do happen. Next is war and terrorism. So let me just read this. The most obvious global flow threatening the nation states involved the war and also terrorism. So right now, I really don't know what's the status between Ukraine and Russia right now, but obviously they have affected our oil production. And because it affected our oil production, it affected our economy. And since it affected our economy, political flows do happen as well. So war and terrorism is very obvious. It was very obvious that it poses a threat, not just in the countries who are currently involved in the in the war, but also in other countries as well. Because of course, I've already mentioned this before, the supply and demand, the economics, how it flows in different countries also is affected. So if there are countries who are actually in conflict with each other, it will affect the economy and the politics as well. So is terrorism. That's why America and other countries are trying to eradicate terrorism, because it poses a threat, not just in a specific country, but it also poses a threat on the unification or the unity between the countries. All right, so that's it. So that's why we have war and also terrorism. Next is global inequalities. So global inequalities, let me just read this, threaten to pit poor nations against rich nations. So global inequalities, unfortunately, I've already mentioned this a couple of times before, poor countries becomes more poor and rich countries becomes more richer. And because of this global inequalities, let's add up racism, discrimination, and yeah, racism and discrimination. Because of it, politics are also are now being involved. I've recently watched this Korean video wherein a Korean actress is actually mocking Filipinos for having an accent because of how we speak in English. Well, honestly, I really don't know how other countries sees us whenever we speak in English. I don't know if we do have a very thick accent that's worthy of laughter or a joke, but in Korea, unfortunately, I don't know if any of you guys is a fan of Korean bands or anything, but unfortunately, some of them, I'm not saying most of them, but some of them are actually laughing at our accents, our English accents. So because of that, those kinds of discriminations, those kinds of views and prejudices that are being done to other countries, like for example us, one of the third world countries in the world, unfortunately, because of this, political flows also happens. All right, so here are some questions that you need to ponder, but um, I will not ask you to do this an activity. I just want you to just read through it, but I will not be asking you anything from this. All right, so now let's talk about nation. So when we talk about nation, let me just read on the slide. A nation is a social group linked through common descent rather, culture, language, or territorial contiguity. So a nation is it is obvious, a social group that we have the same or common culture, language, and territorial contiguity. Let me just emphasize this a lot. So here in our country, we have different kinds of dialects, right? So here in our country, it's very common, and it's still a debate right now if Tagalog is our first language, because a lot of other country, I mean not countries, but a lot of provinces here in our country are saying that Tagalog should not be the first language, because Tagalog is only utilized here in Metro Manila, and it doesn't mean that it is utilized only here in Metro Manila. It has to be the language of the whole country, because of course we have Cebuano, Waray. I really don't know what other dialects, and I do apologize about that. But actually, they do have a point, because, for example, in Mindanao is way bigger than Metro Manila. It's just that Metro Manila is so populated enough that it seems that it's bigger, but it's not. Okay, so let me just emphasize this a lot. Okay, so when we say language, it also consists of different dialects, and of course, if you are under a specific dialect, and you and it's still under a language, and you are in the same territory, you have the same culture, though of course we have different subcultures as well, you are under a nation. So for example, here in our country, you are under the Philippine nation. You are a nationality here in the Philippines. That's why it's called a nation. All right, now we already know what a nation is. Now let's define state. So, state is an organizational structure outside other socioeconomic hierarchies with relatively autonomous office holders. All right, so let me just go back to nation. When we say nation, it has only one government. But when we say a state, it actually can function autonomously, autonomously apart from the nation. Okay, so let me just emphasize this. So, as an example of state is like the United States. That's why it's called United States because it is united. However, they function autonomously, differently from each other. So, for example, I really don't know what are the different states in America. I know Texas, I believe. Texas is a state, but for example, there is a crime that is being committed in one state. However, that person transferred to another state. Unfortunately, that person will that person cannot be okay. I have to repeat my example so to be clear. So we have state A and also state B. For example, a person who is currently living in state A committed the crime. So that state will be the one responsible for that person. So they should be the one who will put that person in court. However, if that person transferred to another state, like for example state B, um, unfortunately state A cannot go beyond its boundary and catch up to that person in state B. However, that the government in state A can actually just tap on the government in state B and to notify that there is a criminal going around the state. So my point in here is that in state, if nation works as a whole and it follows the whole system of that country, okay, of that government, in state it can work autonomously. However, they are united and they are reporting in one head, which is like for example, our former President Trump. All right, their former President Trump. All right, so like unlike in our country, we are only governed by one body, which is obviously our government, which is Marcos and his associates. And then, but in the United States, actually, it's actually being governed by different states, and then those different states are reporting to one government body, which is the president. So that's the difference between nation and states. All right, so when we say nation state, so this is the combination of these two, it means that it is the integration of the different subgroups that define themselves as a nation with the organizational structure of the state. Okay, so this is a very new one. So typically, we just have a nation, country is just being defined as a nation, and then it's either a state. But this is the combination of the two. So this one, in here, they define themselves like a nation, but is organized and governed by the state. So I hope that's clear. So the nation is a nation, however, they are governed by a state. If I'm not mistaken, this is what was Duterte, our former President Duterte, is trying to do. So he wanted to have a nation state kind of politics that we have. Politics. So that's why I believe there are a lot of fans before of the President Duterte, former President Duterte, that emphasizes different flags in our country because they wanted to have a nation state kind of government. And because of that, if that happens, so for example, I live in Quezon City, so my state is State of Quezon City, but I'm still under the nation of the Philippines, of State of Makati, but still under the nation of the Philippines. If that happens, it means to say that the government or the mayor of the state in Quezon City will be the one who will govern the whole Quezon City. And he or that person or the mayor of that city will just report to the nation, which is the president. So all of the crimes, all of the and economics will work autonomously. All right, so what are the threats to the nation states? So first, we have the global flows. The borderless global economy nation states are unable to control. So one of the threats is the global flows. So because of that, different kinds of global economy coming in and out of the country of a nation state is something that is hard to control for a country who has a nation state. So that's actually a huge discussion, but I want you to remember this one. That is the global flows. Next is the universal human rights. Okay, so this is very, very much politically inclined here in our country, especially when Duterte, former President Duterte, is still in the seat. All right. So since states will be having now their own autonomous um, government, the the universal human rights, those who actually controls and look towards the rights of the people, because the state, I mean, for example, state of Quezon City, because for example, Mayor, if I'm not mistaken, it's Joy, Mayor Joyce. I know, I forgot. I really forgot. I'm really sorry about that. But whoever, for example, our mayor will be the one who will govern the rules and regulations and the laws surrounding Quezon City, because it's now called State of Quezon City. If that happens, nation state. Um, Now the universal human rights will keep on tapping in and checking in whether that state is functioning based on the rights of the people, or if there are people who are offended and needs to be uh, defended. Okay, so that's why it's one of the threats of the nation states, countries as well. And because of that, other sovereign states like ICC, which is also very much known to actually wanted to help the country right now, will be also tapping in and would like to join the universal human rights. So as you can see, that's why nation state is also one of the things that is hard to actually consider. All right. So further, we have the liquid sovereignty. So let me just read that. I'm sorry, liquid sovereignty. So that's climate refugees due to losing of its territories, nutrition, and hunger of people can put legitimacy at risk. All right. So I've already mentioned this a while ago. Refugees, those who actually go to another territories and actually start to live there. That's actually one of the threats of nation state, because again, like what I've mentioned a while ago, those who are under a state will be governed by that state only. And because of the different kinds of instances, like for example, there we have refugees from other countries, we have people who are getting different territories. Well, that still happen here in our country. Okay, these are a huge threat to a nation or a country who is under nation state. All right, so now let's talk about nation state defendant. So the role of the state is enduring and even increasing in industrial societies. So state is actually a good governing body, because it works now in United States, and it's been going on since years ago. I'm not even alive. It started already, but in other countries we still have this nation approach. Like here in the Philippines, we have nation approach. But however, a lot has been emphasizing the use or the integration between the two. It actually helped people, especially societies, to become more advanced and industrialized. That's according to Daniel Daland. So there are four major sources of collective insecurity, greater demands of the states. So first, the major source of insecurity, according to in this slide, we have first terrorism. That's very obvious. That's also a threat. Next is economic globalization. One of this is outsourcing. Like for example, here in our country, we have the BPOs, business process outsourcing. So for a state, that's actually something that is threatening and will be a source of insecurity, because of course, a state functions autonomously. So of course, they wanted to have their economy grow bigger and advance. So if they continuously outsource, their own people might not have a job. Yeah, might not they might not utilize their own people. and because of that, the economy might also fall. Next is immigration threats to national identity. So we have immigrants. So I've already mentioned this a while ago, but when we say immigrants, these are people who might, well, majority gets legalized to actually immigrate to their state, and because of that, there's actually views that as an insecurity and also a threat for a threat. Also, this also triggers a lot to actually put on a state kind of government. Next is the spread of global diseases like AIDS, COVID-19 virus, and many more. If we have, if we have a state, all right, that person who's governing that state, well, can close its boundaries, not not encouraging the spread of COVID-19. But since we are, like for example, here in our country, we are working as a nation. Because of that, we are just following the orders of the one who is actually above, which is our president. And because of that, if the president sees that closing our territories, closing our boundaries can actually affect our economy, um, COVID-19 and other major diseases can go inside. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's what happened, unfortunately. But yeah, that's what happened. And not just only in the Philippines who actually that happened, but majority of the country in the world, that's what happened. All right, so changes in global nation state relation. I'm sorry, that's supposed to be state. So we have globalization involves free flows, especially of an economic nature. So I've already discussed this before. But when we say globalization, it's actually a free flow of an economic nature. That's why majority of my discussion, as if you've noticed, I've just focused on economic aspect, because that's what globalization is talking about. Again, that's globalization. Now let's talk about geopolitics. When we say geopolitics, aligning with our political flows discussion, it involves largely political and military efforts aimed to control those economic flows. Okay, when we say globalization, we're just focusing on economy. But when we talk about geopolitics, we are now talking about controlling the economic flows with the use of politics and military efforts. All right, so that's how political flows actually affects globalization. All right, so all right, so I think that's it. But hold on, let me just go on with this one. So we have the 21st century, the emergence of a new big three. So this is in Kana in 2008, puts in the web of globalization now has three spiders. So when we talk about globalization, so we have the three new big three. All right. So we have the Europe, the China, and the United States. All right. So these three countries, that's why it's called the big three, is because they are the ones who actually has an effect on the has an effect, bigger effect in our economy. And they are the ones who actually, because of them, I'm not saying too much about it, but because of them, they're actually the ones who's moving everything around, the economic flow, the political flow, and many more. All right, so we have the European Union. So they are very important in social, economic, and political. China, I'm sorry about that. China is the largest trading nation. In 2012, they have resources for oil, gas, and minerals. I'm sorry about my slides, but this is the United States. This is the largest contributor to the United Nations, and they're actually number one. Whenever we go, our televisions is filled up with United States related stuff, movies, music, and many more. All right, they are also in a civil society, so the process through which individuals negotiate, argue, struggle against, or agree with each other, and with the centers of political economic authority. So these are the ones, they are the three big names the spiders that what the author a while ago was saying, they're actually under the civil society wherein they negotiate, argue, and struggle with each other and talk to each other, and also affects the political economies as well. We have the global civil society, a global non-governmental, pluralistic form of society composed of interlinked social processes oriented to civility. Okay, so this is a non-government. However, this is a civil society. So actually, like what I've mentioned a while ago, three of them are actually part of the civil society, but three of them working together. They're linked together. A non-official government organization, they actually they're under the global civil society. So characteristics of a global civil society: they are first non-governmental, so they are not official. Next, they are a form of society composed of interlinked social processes. They're oriented to civility, non-violence, and they're pluralistic. When we say pluralistic, they include strong potential to reduce conflict, and also they are global. All right.